at tapping into your knowledge base. And so over the course of this semester and ideally moving forward, I want to devote the afternoon sessions to hearing from you all. There's I'm not in the classroom alongside you guys, and it helps me to know what your challenges are, but also, we have a lot of teachers that come regularly. It would be good for you to hear from one another as well. So these guys signed up early enough that, although, I only came to them on Monday. I've asked them to get the conversation started for us this afternoon. I'll let them introduce themselves, but and most of you probably already know them, or at least have seen them on Saturdays. But each of them have experience with teaching something about 9/11 in various settings, different student bodies, different approaches, and I think it would help us to hear from them. But this conversation is an open one, and you all should, I think this will be a very different discussion than the one this morning, where all of the questions were for the panelists. Pretty much, I'd like to hear more from the audience about how you're approaching the subject of 9/11. And one final note before I turn things over, I'll start with Michal, if you don't mind. This is Fatima, everyone. She's an MA student in our program, and she is serving as a videographer today. Don't be nervous. She's going to be filming you, but we're not posting it on the web or anything. There's an important person that couldn't be here today who's going to be working with the teachers on programs, and we wanted to make sure that we could convey what was said to her. It's possible that the video might be so wonderful that we want to do something with it later, and I assure you that if we do have that plan, we will come to you and make sure it's okay. So don't feel nervous, just pretend it's not there. It's just a record of the day for the moment.
Yeah, I just want to mention that one of the goals coming out of this conversation would be to try to put together some materials, maybe publish some things, maybe even a book about teaching 9/11 that has teacher voice in it, that has it's something that's co-authored or written between experts and the Middle Eastern experts and fine arts faculty and teachers. So I just want to say that the goal would be to develop stuff that's by and for teachers on the issues that we're starting to talk about today. So it's a larger project that this conversation, I think, can really benefit lots of people, because I think the way I see it is everybody in this room is kind of a leader in this area. The fact that you're here on this day, taking time out to be here, is indicative of that. So,
Well, and I think one thing that's also important to remember, and I'm kind of crafting with Robbie the best way to go about this over the year, and there will be opportunities for some of you to get more involved if this is an issue you feel really passionately about and want to be involved in doing some research and writing on curriculum. Please, I will sort of send invitations to all of you to let me know that, but if you already know you're interested, let me know. But I think there's a valuable conversation that can take place in this project between many of you who, and actually many of you have the luxury of teaching more specialized courses even on the Middle East exclusively, Middle East history or Middle East politics courses. And you all have a very different range of possibilities for teaching about some of these issues than a U.S. history teacher does, or a world history teacher. And I know many of you wear multiple hats and maybe are doing all of those things at once, but I think for me anyway, as someone who focuses on Middle East studies, it's very easy for me to forget that not everyone thinks about the Middle East all the time and teaches about the Middle East all the time and cares as much as I do, or as we collectively do. So I just want that to be sort of a part of the challenges that we remember to address, I guess. So with that, Michal, Joan, Erin, and Bram, thank you so much, and I'll let you, please introduce yourselves, what you do at your schools, and say what you're going to say.
So you just want our introductions, or do you want us to discuss our...
Both.
Okay, wonderful. I'm Michal Hershkovitz. I'm the chair of the history department at Poly Prep Country Day School in Brooklyn. Poly Prep is an independent school, a non-denominational independent school. And there I teach a variety of grades. The 10th grade world history curriculum, which is a 20th century based curriculum. U.S. history, the survey course, and an elective, a senior elective, actually open to juniors as well, on the history and politics of the modern Middle East. Poly Prep, interestingly, is a school not unlike many schools in New York City that had personal connections to 9/11 in the sense that some of its alumni, a sizable number in terms of loss in human life, were actually victims of 9/11. And Poly set aside a memorial garden to commemorate 9/11 so that every year since the event, Poly students and families of those who lost young men at 9/11 come to commemorate the lives lost, the sheer, tragedy, which in some senses makes my responsibility as a teacher of this event, whether in the context of the global curriculum in the 10th grade or in the Middle East curriculum, both easier and harder. Easier because one could say that the issue of dealing with the tragic aspect that the professors described, that necessity that we all feel as Americans, as family members, as colleagues, whatever it may be, to commemorate the lives and the pain and the loss, that in some sense is quote-unquote taken care of by this ceremony. Harder because when my students get to the class, they naturally expect a continuation of that, if not a way of helping them to deal with the emotional piece that they've just experienced. My training as a political scientist has always pushed me in the classroom to ask them two questions of every event, of which they tire by the end of any given year. The two questions are why and so what. What are the causes of a given event? The why question. And the so what, which they're much less familiar with, the significance of a given event. And I'm very transparent with them. Why have I selected, or why has your textbook selected these events? We could have spoken about any number of events that would have qualified as history. So it's the what is history discussion, which I'm sure many of us do. And in applying it to this particular event, I come across the challenges that you can imagine. Well, what do you mean, is it significant? Of course it's significant. And then we begin to tease it apart. Significant for what, for whom, in what ways? I first taught this at Poly Prep last year, which happened to coincide with the 10th anniversary of 9/11, so that our teachers were asked as a group to commemorate the event in our classrooms in some way or another. And I use the word commemorate loosely because we are given, as teachers in an independent school, we are given really full autonomy in our classrooms, which is something I cherish. And it was on the event of that 10th anniversary that, like other teachers in our department, I began to scramble. I was new to the school then, and the lesson that emerged is this. I liked it so well, though, that I did use it again this year with my seniors. And the lesson really is broken into the two components that I've mentioned to you earlier, the why and the so what. And having culled from the internet, from sources that all of us use and that I would like to credit, although I can't do so in name. In other words, this is not an original lesson. It is culled from a variety of sources that I gathered from various websites. But it goes like this. It's framed like this. Why? So I found online at least 5 explanations for why 9/11 might have happened. The first explanation regards it as a crime. Again, please note this is not my original work. I want to be very cautious as we train our students to be and not receiving any credit for this. 9/11 is crime. It was a criminal attack perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. The second why, potential answer, is it's a clash of civilizations scenario. And we all know the Huntington model that characterizes Western and Muslim civilizations as in some sense oppositional. The model by Samuel Huntington has been much written about. I won't go into it here. There have been defenses of the model, there have been critiques of it, and I try to give my students a nuanced view of what Huntington actually said and how his words have been interpreted. The third potential answer is that this is a global insurgency, that is, it's larger than Al-Qaeda, but it is perpetrated by non-state actors. The fourth, that it's a movement of Islamic Reformation, that is, it's an intra-Islamic conflict within the Muslim world, of some fundamentalist segments of that world battling more reformist, call it westernized if you want, segments of that world. So again, taking it out of our context of our war with Al-Qaeda or our war with other entities and bringing it back into the Muslim world. And finally, an explanation that reaches to Islamofascism. This is World War IV. And I ask my students to look at it. I divide them into groups, and I say, okay, I'm going to assign you one of these models. If you were working from this perspective, if you were assuming that this event happened because of reformist elements within the Islamic world, when would you date the start of this quote-unquote war? Who would you identify as the enemy? What do you think should U.S. foreign policy objectives be, given that this is your explanation? My goal here, as you'll recognize immediately, is to acquaint students very intimately with this notion that different lenses or different perspectives, frameworks for understanding, lead us in different directions into different conclusions. So that as groups they work this out, and already from the sharing portion it becomes very evident that there are various ways in which to look at this, and any number of these ways actually do suggest different alternatives in terms of response. Am I going too long?
No, you can have a couple more minutes.
Okay. Finally, I get to the consequences model, and I ask them, and this question is very hard for them, so what? Was 9/11 significant? And having prepared them with some articles that I've been happy to share with you, one by Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. I depend a lot at the high school level, by the way, on the Council on Foreign Relations website. I find it very accessible to students at this age. The Richard Haas is called 9/11 in Perspective. It was written in 2011. Another article that I assign is by Charles Kupchan, also from the Council on Foreign Relations, in which Kupchan maps out in what ways 9/11 was not significant in terms of international strategy or the international system. And then I ask them to look at an article that places the burden, if you will, for combating tendencies which produced 9/11 on the Muslim world and its ongoing internal struggle between reformism and fundamentalism. So it is that part of the conversation that's harder, and I think you've already anticipated that. To have students come to terms with different scholars' perspectives and then their own about the difference between 9/11 as a national tragedy and 9/11 as an internationally significant event. I've always found that this lesson produces wonderful conversations. Above all, for me as a teacher, conversations about how we as Americans contend with fear. Fear of the other, fear of threat. And it's that piece of it, which actually it doesn't belong in the Middle East classroom, it really belongs in the U.S. history classroom. It's actually been the most meaningful for me as a teacher.
You didn't give us a time, I don't even know, but you'll let me know.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Joan Brodsky Shore. I've been a long time 7th and 8th grade teacher, and at the Village Community School, beginning in 1998, I developed a course on the Islamic world for 7th graders. Since then, I've become sort of a social studies consultant to City and Country School. I also run a course in Morocco for Bank Street College of Education. Sorry. So in 2011, I was asked to be part of a sort of reflection on how to teach 9/11, and it wasn't much fun, to go back, and I think as New Yorkers, we're more intimately connected, but we're also the ones who don't go to visit the site. Everybody else in America wants to go, so I made my first visits back there. I'm extremely emotional. Weeks that I spent really sort of thinking about this, and came to the conclusion, as other people have said here, that memorialization is different from teaching. It has a different purpose and meaning, and we shouldn't conflate the two. And then I started looking for ways in which to put 9/11 in the context of other events in American history. I'll get a little bit more later to the international, but how to frame it in terms of looking at it as part of American history. And I was looking also for ways, since how are we going to teach about 9/11? It's either going to be commemoration events, which have a different purpose, or it's going to be at the very end of the textbook where we may never get to it. So I was looking for sort of points of communality with other events in in American history, so that we could raise an issue and then also incorporate 9/11 into that. And so here are the ones that I came up with. I'm sure there are more. And actually the first one is very positive, and I think it addresses a little bit some of the concerns that came up earlier. Are we always going to be browbeating ourselves or seen to be browbeating ourselves for our roles in world history? And that's what accounts for the resiliency and spirit of volunteerism in the United States. Because, that day had very many positive aspects to it in terms of the reaction of the public, the reaction of the local police, the number of people who were out there helping other people. And I think we owe it to ourselves to ask, what kind of society are we that produces that kind of result among citizens? And there are comparisons. There's a really wonderful comparison in the Revolutionary War where Washington is backed up against the East River and all these boats come out to help his army cross over. And actually a very similar thing happened. There was a lot of rescue on the water that people don't know about. Boats just came in rescuing people from downtown Manhattan. So, or we could look at the Great Depression and how citizens reacted and helped one another, and government agencies and so forth. The second sort of theme that I located for myself was the U.S. How does the U.S. government need to protect the safety of citizens while also protecting our civil liberties? That's a theme that you can go back to. Lincoln and the habeas corpus that he gave up on, or the Espionage Act and in World War I. And then, of course, getting to the Patriot Act and various things, Guantanamo. What's this balance? What are we willing to give up for safety in terms of civil liberties? And so I think we can incorporate a lot of 9/11 in those overall issues. And how are these acts judged over time? Because, they're motivated by fear in the first instance. But then how do we evaluate some of these things constitutionally when we look back on them? Then, when is military intervention justified? I think this is a great opportunity to teach about declarations of war. If you look at Roosevelt's declaration of World War II and compare it to just war theory, when is war for just? It's a beautiful statement that really applies what became sort of the Geneva Conventions of just war theory. And other speeches to compare, of course, two George Bush speeches. One, 2001, which was the leading up to the invasion of Afghanistan, and then the second one with the war in Iraq, which really was a preemptive war, a defensive preemptive war, basically. But I think that just war theory should be part of this discussion, and so forth. Then, once at war, how do we protect our citizens who are at risk for reprisal? The Japanese internment, for example, or German Americans during both World Wars. And we haven't really talked about, Arab Americans in this story, both as victims in 9/11, as rescuers afterwards, as the backlash that they experienced. And this is a common story in American history, and I think we've learned. I do think we have improved and learned, as although horrible things happened, I don't think they're as horrible as what happened to Japanese Americans. And by the way, Japanese Americans were among the very first groups to come to the defense of Arab Americans after this event. And then finally, and this gets a little bit more to the international aspect, what should be the relationship of the United States to the international world order? And this is a theme throughout American history, isolationism, interventionism, our willingness or unwillingness to sign documents like the League of Nations, the Geneva Conventions, membership in the United Nations. Are we exceptional? So, what is our relationship to acting unilaterally, acting, with other organizations and so forth? And then I alluded a little bit in some of my questions about the rhetoric of war and how students can look critically at sources of information and so forth. By the way, I want to mention Robert Byrd gave the most beautiful speech right after President Bush's speech, and it should be looked at as a kind of counterpoint. It's an amazing speech, and I'm hoping it's going to get into textbooks long after, because there were people who were not cowed by sort of issues of loyalty and patriotism. This is so often the case. This is not the first time that this has happened. And then just in terms of teaching about sort of the broader perspective internationally, I would locate two things that are important. Certainly World War I, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the creation of the states of the Middle East, and then the end of the Cold War, where we were, because of our fear of communism, we were supporting the freedom fighters who became, we were supporting the Mujahideen and so forth. And I think students we need to go back to that event and understand its origins at the end of the Cold War. And then we haven't really talked at all about teaching about Islam in this. I don't want to open that whole thing since it's such a major part of what we need to do. But I think in the teaching about it, we can't be defensive. We can't have this be a dialogue with people who have taken extreme interpretations of a religion far outside the historical history of Islam. And the only thing I can say about that very quickly is that I think in our teaching, the 5 pillars of Islam do nobody any favor. They make it simplified. They make everyone feel, oh, I know about this religion. I can name the 5 pillars. And this is, we need such a much deeper, richer appreciation of, this great world religion with a long history of scholarship, interpretation, its own just war theories, which deserve to be looked at. And so whenever I have taught about Islam, I never start with the 5 pillars. I back into them. I start with Abraham, I start with historical context, and through an understanding of text, religious text, then emerges, oh, this is what, this is why those 5 pillars are important. If you start with them, it becomes way too simple. People think they're understanding something that they you know, it just takes longer than that and a deeper appreciation. So.
My name is Erin Dowding. I teach at Flushing International High School. It's a public school in Queens made up entirely of recent immigrants who've been in the country less than 4 years upon entering and who have failed the English test, so they're English language learners. We're a project-based school, all of ESL instructions taught through content curriculum. And I teach currently and have for the past 3 years there, though I've taught 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade at that same school. I currently teach an 11th grade humanities class, which is English literature and U.S. history combined. We teach our U.S. history class for 2 years, and so I have the first half. And we talked a little bit over lunch. I try to teach thematically rather than chronologically, which works and doesn't work and has its own sort of issues. For as long as I've taught, I've been at this school for 9 years, and each year I've taught something about September 11th. But I came today, as I was telling Greta, to learn more. Nothing's nearly as formal as what you guys are doing, but it's always seemed to be, needed to be addressed in some form. And so for part of me thought for a while that perhaps it was me being selfish, knowing that it was an important event for me, an important event to the United States, that it felt sort of indulgent to a certain degree, but also highly needed. And so how to reckon with that, especially the beginning of the school year. For 75% of my students, this is the first time they've ever taken U.S. history. So it's a rush to just kind of get some background there. They've had 2 years by 11th grade of global history in the United States. But our demographics are one where there's about 45 different native countries in the school, a range of native languages, and past experiences. So one year I had tons of resources that I wanted to somehow use, and much like Sandra was talking about before, I had found facing history stuff on memorials. I thought I wanted to do something on memorials, and a very good friend of mine had worked on an audio piece called the Sonic Memorial. And so I'd had those CDs and that website, which is phenomenal, sort of big, broad history of the World Trade Center and the towers. Anything from the Mohawk Indians who came and erected the building to also came back and took it down. And I wanted to use that, and I wanted to just talk about what that meant. A colleague of mine that I had met with worked at, and still does, works at Stuyvesant, and she had put together a book with her students called With Their Eyes, based on sort of performance pieces of the type of work that Anna DeVere Smith does. And so I wanted to use some of that. And Radio Rookies, which is a program, another radio program that mentors teenagers in various neighborhoods to do radio stories and get put on WNYC, had a series of things, and I wanted to use those. And it worked. I had students sort of explore this. And it worked, but it was big and lofty and unwieldy. We looked at different memorials of different times in the United States. We talked about sort of what had happened. But it wasn't just teaching 9/11 itself. Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the year, I'm trying to just sort of talk about what the United States is with my students and get some of those ideas out. And for everyone, it's a very different idea in my classroom. And so the past 3 years, I guess, I've mainly started with talking about why do we study history and what does it mean to remember something, and how is that in relation to this event. Everyone knows this, and I've wondered more and more if it's even going to become relevant. I know my students weren't in the United States, and I was sort of shocked by one of my classes, a class of 25. There were at least 5 students who had one parent that were in New York at that time. So even though they were just little kids, they were watching the news, there was something at stake. It's still very present, and I sort of was trying to figure out sort of where you go with that. So it's been much looser sort of beginning of the year talk recently, and one that we follow up on all year, but sort of why do we study these things? What does this mean, and how has the world changed since then?